The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like cannon fire as the judge bellowed with a fury that made the walls tremble. His face was flushed with rage. The veins in his neck stood out like taut ropes, and his eyes shone with a lust for power that frightened even the most seasoned court clerks. The single mother before him trembled visibly, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white, while silent tears streamed down her weary face. She had come to this courtroom seeking only a fair custody hearing for her children, but what she was receiving was a public humiliation that would break any ordinary person. The judge rose from his seat like a predator poised to pounce, pointing his accusing finger directly at her, and shouted in a voice that made everyone in the room cower in fear. "I don't care about your pathetic excuses, ma'am. You will learn today what it means to disrespect my authority in this court." The echo of her words hung in the air like a death sentence, as the woman desperately tried to find words to defend herself. She stammered apologies, explanations of her desperate financial situation, of how she was struggling to keep her 3 children fed and a roof over their heads. But every word that came out of her mouth only fueled the sadistic fury of the judge, who seemed to delight in every moment of suffering he was causing. The lawyers in the room exchanged worried glances, some whispering among themselves about the judge's completely inappropriate behavior, but no one dared intervene against this tyrant in the black robe. The tension in the room was so thick it could have been cut with a knife, and the silence that followed the judge's shouts was deafening. The clerk stopped typing, the security guard shifted uncomfortably, and even the other court staff seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how far this insane situation would go. The single mother remained there, standing before this altar of injustice in her simple, worn clothes, her old purse clutched to her chest like a pathetic shield against the cruelty she was facing. But what this arrogant judge didn't know was that in exactly 17 minutes, a phone call would completely destroy his career when he discovered who this humble person's godfather really was. What you're about to witness is the most satisfying revenge ever documented in an American courtroom. This woman, who seemed like just another desperate person navigating the judicial system, carried a secret that would transform that moment of humiliation into the most spectacular downfall of a corrupt judge in modern history. Subscribe now because you have never seen justice served like this, and I guarantee you'll want to watch this video at least 3 times to capture every detail of this epic turn of events. The judge continued his sadistic tirade, completely oblivious to the fact that he was digging his own professional grave with every venomous word that came out of his mouth, while fate was already in motion to deliver the most costly lesson of his life. This extraordinary woman's story began 3 years earlier, when she lost her husband in a horrific car accident that shattered not only her family, but also her entire financial stability. She had worked as a registered nurse for over 15 years, dedicating her life to caring for others, but the astronomical medical bills from her husband's treatment in the final months of his life forced her to sell everything she owned. With 3 young children to raise alone, she struggled every day to maintain her dignity and find work in an increasingly competitive market, facing discrimination for being a single mother and having gaps on her resume due to caring for her sick husband. Her situation became even more desperate when she lost her apartment and was forced to move into a temporary shelter. But even in the most difficult circumstances, she never lost her natural compassion and her determination to give her children a better life. But what was about to happen in that courtroom would be the most satisfying revenge you've ever seen. On the other side of this toxic equation was a judge whose dark reputation was whispered through the courthouse corridors like a haunted urban legend. During his 20 years on the bench, he had built an empire of fear based on public humiliation, arbitrary decisions, and a sick pleasure in wielding power over vulnerable people. His sentences were known to be disproportionately harsh when it came to defendants from lower socioeconomic classes, while displaying a suspicious leniency toward white-collar criminals who shared his social circle. Experienced lawyers told horrifying stories about his outbursts of temper, how he would turn routine hearings into spectacles of cruelty, and how he seemed to feed on the tears and despair of those who appeared before him. Fellow judges had tried discreetly to intervene several times over the years, but his political connections made him virtually untouchable, or so he believed. This judge had no idea he had chosen the wrong person to humiliate. But there was a third element to this story that remained completely hidden in the shadows of the American judiciary. A figure whose influence extended far beyond the district courts, reaching all the way to the highest levels of the Supreme Court, someone whose name was spoken with reverence and respect throughout the country's legal circles. This person had spent decades building an impeccable reputation based on integrity, social justice, and protecting the rights of the most vulnerable, becoming one of the most respected voices in the fight against judicial corruption. For years, This powerful figure had maintained a discreet watch over cases of abuse of power, compiling evidence and waiting for the right moment to act decisively against corrupt judges who tarnished the dignity of the American judicial system. And by a twist of fate that would change everything, this person had a deep and personal connection with the humble woman who was being humiliated at that moment. Because the person who was about to receive a call in 15 minutes had the power to end his career with a single signature. Comment: if you have ever experienced injustice in the system, because this story will show that sometimes justice really does exist. The judge's contempt was so palpable that it seemed to permeate the air in the courtroom, creating a toxic atmosphere that made everyone present feel uncomfortable. He examined the woman before him as if she were something disgusting he had stepped on, his eyes roaming over her simple clothing, her worn purse, her clearly repeatedly patched shoes. With a cruel smile that didn't reach his cold eyes, he began making comments that cut like sharp knives, questioning not only her ability as a mother, but her very dignity as a human being. He sarcastically asked if she truly believed she could raise children properly living in a shelter. If she understood that children needed stability she clearly couldn't provide, and if it wouldn't be more responsible to let suitable families adopt her children. Every word was calculated to cause maximum emotional damage, and the judge watched with sadistic pleasure as tears began to well in the woman's eyes. The humiliation was systematic and deliberate, designed to completely break down her resistance and make an example of her to anyone who dared question her absolute authority. The woman tried to explain herself with what dignity she had left, talking about her efforts to find work, the interviews she'd had that week, the professional development course she was taking online at night after her children were asleep. Her voice trembled but remained respectful, her words chosen carefully so as not to further anger the judge, and she maintained a submissive posture, hoping the storm would pass quickly. She explained the letters of recommendation she'd obtained from former employers, the social assistance program she was enrolled in, and her detailed plan to secure an apartment as soon as her first paycheck arrived. But every reasonable explanation she offered only fueled the judge's fury, who interpreted any attempt at defense as disrespectful and a challenge to his supreme authority. But that was only the first humiliation. The worst was yet to come. Suddenly, the judge's tone shifted from cruel to downright explosive, transforming the courtroom into a verbal war zone that shocked even the most seasoned court staff. He stood abruptly, knocking papers off his desk, and began bellowing accusations that echoed off the walls like furious thunder. His words became a barrage of judgments about the poor, about single mothers, about people who, in his distorted opinion, were parasites of the American social system. He accused the woman of being irresponsible, of seeking unnecessary government benefits, of raising children who would likely become delinquents because they lacked a strong father figure at home. The volume of his voice steadily increased, transforming the hearing into a spectacle of cruelty that made those in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some people began to whisper among themselves, clearly disturbed by the disproportionate display of aggression, while others simply lowered their heads, unable to watch the humiliation unfolding before them. If you think this is bad enough, wait until you see what he does next. Sign up because it's about to get much worse. What happened next surpassed all bounds of human decency and the professional behavior expected of a judge. The judge decided to turn the hearing into a public spectacle of humiliation, inviting court staff to witness what he called a perfect example of parental irresponsibility. He ordered the clerk to write down every word of her scathing criticism, saying he wanted to officially document the woman's unfitness as a mother, and instructed security to remain close should she attempt any disturbance or disrespect. With a cruelty that made one's blood run cold, he began commenting on the woman's physical appearance, how her cheap, worn-out clothing reflected her inability to properly care for herself, questioning how someone who couldn't even dress properly could be responsible for the well-being of 3 children. He laughed sarcastically when she tried to explain that she had bought the outfit at a thrift store because it was all she could afford, saying it only confirmed his theory about people living off society. At that moment, someone in the room was recording everything, and that video was about to change everything. The woman's desperate attempt to maintain some dignity in the face of this relentless attack was heartbreaking. She tried to explain her situation in a voice that trembled with suppressed emotion, speaking of the sacrifices she had made to keep her family together after her husband's death, of the sleepless nights, caring for him during his terminal illness, of how she had even sold her wedding jewelry to pay for medications not covered by insurance. Her words painted a picture of a woman who had faced tragedies that would break most people, but who continued to fight with a determination that should inspire respect rather than contempt. She mentioned the part-time job she had tried to balance with her husband's medical care, the savings she had watched disappear one by one as she struggled to keep her family financially stable, and the courage it took to continue living after losing the most important person in her life. But every sincere word that came out of her mouth only fueled the judge's thirst for cruelty, who seemed to interpret her vulnerability as weakness and her honesty as cheap emotional manipulation. The judge categorically refused to listen to any explanation, brutally interrupting every attempt at defense and threatening her with arrest for contempt if she continued speaking without express permission. He banged his gavel with excessive force every time she tried to open her mouth, creating an intimidating rhythm that echoed through the room like a countdown to disaster. His threats became more specific and frightening, including the possibility of a search warrant for the home where she was temporarily staying, an investigation by Child Protective Services, and even the suggestion that she could be criminally prosecuted for parental neglect. The air in the room grew even more tense as he began scribbling furious notes on his papers, muttering about legal precedents that could be used to permanently remove custody of his children. What this judge didn't know was that every word was being broadcast live to someone very powerful. The final line was crossed when the judge decided that words were not enough to satisfy his thirst for absolute power. With a dramatic movement that made the entire courtroom hold its breath, he banged his gavel 3 times with deafening force and declared the woman in contempt of court, a completely fabricated charge based solely on his sadistic pleasure in destroying an already broken person. He immediately ordered her arrest, instructing security to handcuff the single mother in front of the entire audience, transforming what should have been a civilized judicial proceeding into a spectacle of cruelty that shocked even the most hardened court staff. The handcuffs gleamed under the fluorescent lights as they were placed on the woman's wrists, who now wept openly, not out of fear for herself, but out of terror that her 3 young children would be left completely alone while she was taken to prison for a crime she had never committed. The metallic clang of the handcuffs echoed through the courtroom like a death knell to any hope of justice that might still exist in this corrupt place. The woman fell into utter despair, begging for mercy, not for herself, but for her children, who would be waiting for her at home, trusting that her mother would return with good news about the hearing. Her tears fell to the floor like raindrops in an emotional storm as she tried to explain that there was no one to care for the children if she were arrested, that they were too young to understand what was happening, that they had already lost their father and could not lose their mother too. Her broken voice echoed through the room with a pain so profound that it touched the hearts of everyone present, except the judge himself, who seemed to be reveling in every second of this psychological torture. She desperately tried to remind the judge that she had committed no real crime, that she had voluntarily attended the hearing, that she had been respectful throughout the proceedings, but her words fell on deaf ears of someone who had completely lost all humanity in his quest for absolute domination. It was at that very moment that the phone rang, and the person on the other end of the line was going to end this judge's life. The ringing of the phone cut through the tense air of the room like an emergency siren, abruptly interrupting the symphony of cruelty being performed by the sadistic magistrate. It was the court's special phone, the one used only for official calls from higher authorities, and its insistent tone made the judge pause his authoritarian tirade for the first time that terrible morning. He glanced at the receiver irritably, clearly displeased at having his display of power interrupted by a call he likely considered less important than his sadistic amusement. For a moment, he considered ignoring the call altogether, but something about the insistent tone of the ringer caused a small seed of apprehension to begin to germinate in his chest. Even so, his arrogance remained unshaken as he reached out to answer it, completely oblivious to the fact that he was about to receive the news that would destroy his professional life forever. The call he was about to take would reveal the most costly mistake of his life. The woman remained there, handcuffed and broken, with no idea that justice was literally ringing the phone at that very moment. The voice on the other end of the line was unmistakably authoritative, laden with decades of judicial experience and a reputation that made even veteran federal judges tremble with respect. It was the Chief Justice of the state's Superior Court, a living legend of American jurisprudence whose influence extended all the way to the Supreme Court, and whose name was whispered with reverence throughout legal circles across the country. His voice cut through the phone like a sharp blade, informing the arrogant judge that he had received a deeply troubling call about the completely inappropriate behavior being exhibited in that courtroom at that very moment. The cruel judge's blood began to run cold as he realized someone had reported his conduct directly to the highest authority in the state's judicial system, someone with the power to destroy careers with a simple official memo. The call continued with specific details about the humiliations he had inflicted on the single mother, about the inappropriate threats he had made, about the blatant abuse of power that was being witnessed by a roomful of people shocked by his deplorable conduct. But the true emotional tsunami was just beginning when the voice on the phone revealed the devastating connection that would transform the situation from dire to utterly catastrophic. The woman handcuffed before him was not just another ordinary citizen struggling financially. She was the Chief Justice's beloved daughter-in-law, the widow of his youngest son, who had served heroically in Afghanistan before dying in a tragic accident 3 years earlier. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening, broken only by the sound of the judge's heavy breathing, as the astronomical magnitude of the error he had made began to sink in. For years, the Chief Justice had quietly and proudly watched as his daughter-in-law struggled to rebuild her life after the devastating loss, admiring her strength, her dignity, and her dedication to the grandchildren he loved as if they were his own. He had silently promised his deceased son that he would always protect this extraordinary woman and the children who were all that remained of his family legacy. The change in the judge's demeanor was so dramatic it was comical, if the situation weren't so serious. His face went from furious red to cadaverous white in a matter of seconds. His hands began to shake violently, and his voice, which moments before had bellowed with tyrannical authority, now came out as a desperate whisper, begging for forgiveness. He looked at the handcuffed woman with eyes that finally reflected the full realization of the professional catastrophe he had created for himself, understanding that he had just publicly humiliated the family of the most powerful man in the state justice system. Panic spread through his body like poison, making him break out in a cold sweat and tremble like a leaf in the wind as he desperately tried to find the words to undo the irreparable. But it was too late. The damage was done, witnessed by dozens of people and now officially reported to the higher court. Comment if you want him fired or arrested, because the revenge is just beginning. The call ended with clear and threatening instructions. The woman was to be immediately released from handcuffs, treated with the utmost respect, and a full administrative investigation would be opened that same day. What followed was the most spectacular humiliation of a corrupt judge ever documented in modern American judicial history. Within minutes, the courtroom transformed into a theater of poetic justice where the roles were completely reversed, and the black-robed tyrant became the victim of his own systematic cruelty. The judge, now trembling like a frightened child, immediately ordered the woman's handcuffs removed, his trembling hands barely able to grip the gavel he had moments earlier used as a weapon of intimidation. He stammered pathetic apologies, desperately trying to reverse decades of abusive behavior in a few minutes of utter panic. But his words sounded hollow and calculating even to his own ears. The woman, now free of the handcuffs but still processing the surreal turn of events she had just witnessed, remained dignified in her silence, letting the situation itself speak louder than any words she could utter. She had gone from manufactured criminal to respected member of the state's most powerful judicial family in a matter of minutes, a transformation that left everyone in the room open-mouthed. The administrative investigation promised by the Chief Justice began immediately, with investigators arriving at the courthouse that afternoon to document every aspect of the judge's inappropriate behavior. Court staff, who for years had been forced to silently witness abuses of power, finally found the courage to speak openly about the systematic pattern of cruelty that had become the judge's hallmark. Lawyers who had avoided his courtroom whenever possible now volunteered to provide testimony about previous instances of public humiliation and clearly biased decisions. Local media quickly picked up the story, turning the case into a national headline about abuse of judicial power and the importance of holding corrupt judges accountable. The video of the humiliation, which had been discreetly recorded by a bystander in the hearing, went viral on social media with millions of views within hours, making the judge the national face of judicial corruption and arrogance that must be eliminated from the American system. But the revenge didn't stop there. What happened in the following days was even more satisfying for anyone who believes in true justice. The State Judicial Council opened formal disciplinary proceedings that resulted in the judge's immediate suspension without pay, while a federal investigation was launched to examine all his cases from the past 10 years for patterns of discrimination and abuse of power. Dozens of people who had been victims of his cruelty over the years began coming forward with their own horrific stories, creating a chorus of voices documenting decades of inappropriate behavior that had been ignored for too long. Civil rights organizations filed class action lawsuits challenging hundreds of his decisions, claiming that his obvious bias had compromised the integrity of the entire district court system. The local bar association initiated its own impeachment proceedings, seeking to permanently strip him of his license to practice law in any capacity. Meanwhile, the woman he had tried to destroy became a national symbol of dignity under pressure, receiving job offers from renowned hospitals and even invitations to speak at conferences on resilience and social justice. The former judge's pathetic apology was publicly rejected by the woman, who stated that she would only accept real systematic changes that would protect other vulnerable people from going through what she had experienced. The final consequences of this poetic justice story unfolded as a perfect symphony of accountability and redemption that restored millions of Americans' faith in the judicial system. Within 3 months, the former judge was formally dismissed from his position, losing not only his position, but also his pension accumulated over a 20-year career, his health benefits, and any possibility of ever working in the American judicial system again. He faced multiple civil lawsuits filed by his previous victims, who collectively sought millions in damages for systematic discrimination and emotional trauma caused by his documented abuses of power. The Federal Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation into possible violations of the constitutional civil rights of hundreds of citizens who had appeared before him throughout his corrupt career. His reputation was so destroyed that he was forced to move to another state, where he lived as a social pariah, unable to find employment in any legal field, and constantly recognized as the national symbol of judicial corruption that he had become. The transformation in this courageous woman's life was equally dramatic, but in a completely opposite direction. She received job offers from some of the country's most prestigious hospitals, which recognized not only her exceptional professional qualifications, but also her strength of character demonstrated under extreme pressure. The Chief Justice, her father-in-law, quietly established an educational fund for his grandchildren, ensuring they would have all the opportunities her courage had earned. She became a national spokesperson for organizations fighting abuse of judicial power, traveling the country to share her story and inspire systemic reforms that would protect other vulnerable citizens. Law schools invited her to lecture on human dignity and the importance of humility on the bench, transforming her traumatic experience into a powerful force for positive social change. Her story inspired legislative changes in several states, including new judicial oversight rules and more accessible reporting channels for victims of abuse of power. The systemic impact of this story extended far beyond the individuals involved, creating ripples of change that transformed judicial culture across the country. Courts in dozens of states implemented new training protocols for judges on respectful treatment of all citizens, regardless of their socioeconomic status. Monitoring systems were established to identify patterns of inappropriate behavior before they could cause widespread harm. The story became a required case study in law schools, teaching future generations of lawyers and judges the importance of humility, empathy, and accountability in the judicial system. The viral video of the confrontation continues to circulate years later as a powerful reminder that no one, no matter how powerful their position, is above accountability and true justice. The powerful moral of this story resonates to this day. Never judge a person by appearances or temporary circumstances, because you never know who stands before you or what connections may exist in the shadows of power. The arrogant former judge learned the hard way that true authority comes from respect and justice, not from intimidation and cruelty. This extraordinary woman proved that dignity cannot be bought or sold, and that sometimes justice can be slow in coming. But when it finally arrives, it is absolutely devastating to those who abuse their power. Share so more people see that justice still exists, and subscribe because we have many more stories like this where powerful people learn that their actions have real consequences. Revenge may be a dish best served cold, but when finally served, it satisfies every person who believes that everyone deserves to be treated with basic dignity, regardless of their station in life.